G'day, everyone. My name's Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. I can see we've already got a couple of hundred people come through the door to join us. We're very happy to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us today. I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And just a few Zoom tips before we get going today to make sure this all runs nice and smoothly. You can type in questions for Joe, our special guest today, using the Q&A box, and you can upvote and comment on other people's questions as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll remove you. And finally, this is a live event, but it is being recorded, and we'll put the recording up on our website later this afternoon. You can find that at australiainstitute.org.au. So this month we are joined by a very special guest, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, a professor at Columbia University, and former chief economist at the World Bank. He's also a best-selling author, and today we're delighted to be talking about his new book, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. It's in all good bookstores at the moment, and it really offers a powerful reevaluation of democracy, economics, and what really constitutes a good society, and a roadmap for how we might achieve it. And I can't wait to talk to you about it. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
Joe's traveling Australia at the moment as a guest of the Australia Institute as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. It's been fabulous having you here and seeing all your amazing sold out shows. And people might have caught him last night on Q&A on ABC. But you, first of all, congratulations on the book. I know you've written many, many books, but it's a really fabulous one. I want to begin with the title, I guess, The Road to Freedom. For decades, it really does seem like freedom, the idea of freedom, it was really one pushed by the right, and particularly in America and American politics, a kind of flag-waving, gun-toting kind of version of freedom and individual liberty above all else. Tell us about your version of freedom, where you ask the question, freedom for who? Whose freedom are we talking about?
Precisely. And what do you mean by freedom? It's concept I call freedom to do things. Somebody who's on the point of starvation doesn't really have freedom. He has to do what he does to survive.
Yeah.
And a very important idea that I have in the context of the American debate is this notion that one person's freedom can impinge on that of another. Or as I put it, one person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. Your right to carry a gun, an AK-47, has resulted in the loss of lives of other people. And the freedom to live has to be weighed against the freedom to carry an AK-47. And my view is most reasonable societies would balance those and say, well, you really don't need to carry around an AK-47 everywhere, and the freedom to live is more important. In that particular case, there's another freedom that one of our great presidents, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talked about, which is freedom from fear. Today, because so many people are carrying around AK-47s, we have a mass murder virtually every day. And little school children, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, have to be trained to know what to do when a gunman comes into their classroom. So they live in fear. The parents live in fear that their children might not come home.
Yeah.
And so even though you might say it's only one a day mass murder across a big country, that one a day instills a kind of national fear. So that's an example of balancing. Isaiah Berlin, one of the great Oxford philosophers, put it, freedom for the wolves as meant death for the sheep.
Yeah. It's an amazing way to put it, I think, because so much of what we hear, particularly from, I guess, the orthodoxy in economics, at least the dominant role that neoliberalism has played, is really this idea, that what's good for companies is kind of what's best for the country, but we know from the results of privatization and all of those kinds of other things, so often it feels like death for the sheep more than freedom for anyone. So I'm curious about, a lot of your life's work is around neoliberalism and the inequality it's produced. How much do you think that can go to explaining the emergence of politicians like Donald Trump, for example, and far-right populist figures?
I think it's played a very important role. The way I like to think about it, it created a fertile field. And over history, we've seen that there's a large supply of demagogues ready to take advantage of that fertile field. You can't predict when it's going to happen. You can't predict the precise nature of the demagogue. I think America was unlucky to have a demagogue as bad as Donald Trump, and in some way as good in the sense that he really has been able to take advantage of the discontent. And it's sort of ironic in a way that you have this inequality in society, partly caused by market power, partly caused by a lack of regulation. So you have people, the corporations exploiting other individuals, exploiting the environment. And Donald Trump is an exploiter. So you have one of the exploiters taking advantage of the neoliberal framework of the right to exploit over the rights of the exploited, and becoming very popular, and saying the system is rigged. Yes, it's rigged in favor of people like you who've taken advantage of others, created a private university, Trump University, that really took advantage of people's aspirations to get ahead.
And I want to kind of talk now, because we've got the US election coming up, obviously. But here in Australia, we've also got a federal election coming probably before May next year. So it could be pretty close as well. We're also, I think, really seeing the problems associated with inflation post-pandemic. Cost of living is a really big economic issue here in Australia, and housing in particular has become a very red hot issue in politics, but more importantly in people's everyday lives. What are some of the ways that you think the Australian government, what are some of the things that they could be doing to alleviate the cost of living and have a good economic story to sell to the public coming up to the next election?
Well, first, let me relate your question to the broader title of my book, which is The Road to Freedom. It's a riff off of a famous book by Friedrich Hayek, who is one of the founders of the extreme right wing. And he wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom. He wrote that book in 1944, in the context of the world recovering from the Great Depression, where we had discovered, Keynes and others, that you could prevent a Great Depression. Government can do things. The market doesn't always work, and government can come in and make sure you don't go into a depression. And it can protect people against insecurity, against old age insecurity. It can make investments on young people so they can live up to their potential. And Hayek worried that this kind of government activity would actually lead to the road to serfdom, would lead to fascism. And I think what we've learned in the subsequent more, 75 years, is that the road to fascism is paved by governments doing too little, not too much. That it's a country like the United States where we've done too little about inequality, too little about market power, that you have an extreme right-wing populist like Donald Trump.
So you think that's not a coincidence, basically?
I think it's not a coincidence, to go back to your question.
Yeah.
So now you're asking a specific question: what can government do to address the specific question that we're facing today? And I think it's important to put it in context. This inflation is a particularity of the pandemic, the war in the Russian invasion in Ukraine. It's a moment, and we're recovering from it fairly rapidly. And the question is, could the government do more? And is the RBA here in Australia doing the right things? And whenever you have a problem, a disease, a doctor, I sometimes think of economists, good economists being like doctors. You diagnose, you see what the problem is. You need to have the cure matched with the disease.
Yep.
If you were a doctor and somebody came in, he said a fever, and for all fevers you did exactly the same thing, that would be bad medicine. You can come in with a fever, and there could be many different causes of that fever. And the same thing about inflation. Sometimes inflation is caused by excess spending. We say excess aggregate demand greater than the supply. That's not the cause of this inflation. In fact, growth has slowed down a little bit. And, there's some worry about not enough growth.
Yeah, in Australia, yes.
And you can't say it's excess demand that's causing the problem and simultaneously say there's a lack of demand. I mean, this incoherent argument that I hear in Australia is a little bit mind-boggling. So you have to look at what is the nature of the problem. I've done that very carefully for the United States, and there are similar patterns globally. Some people here at the Australia Institute have done that for Australia. This is supply-side interruptions, demand shifts caused by the pandemic, caused by the war in Ukraine. It's unambiguous. And in the United States, the first burst of inflation had to do with automobiles. It was about 1/3 of the increase in the cost of living in that one period. What was the problem? A shortage of chips. Another important source of inflation was, of course, was oil and food because of the war in Ukraine. And then another important is housing. Now you start thinking about these causes, these particular causes, and you ask, is the policy of the RBA or the Federal Reserve raising interest rates addressing the disease? You ask, does raising interest rates create more oil? Does it create more food? Does it create more chips? Does it create more houses?
I'm spotting a pattern here.
And the answer is obviously no, but it's worse than that. Let me emphasize, it's worse than that because it makes the problem worse. Part of the problem was supply-side interruptions. Supply-side interruptions need more investment. Part of the problem was housing shortages. Higher interest rates makes it more difficult to make the investments you need to alleviate the shortage of housing. So the RBA policy and the Federal Reserve policy has exacerbated inflation. It's, it's actually made, it's sort of like medieval bloodletting. It made the person's health worse. It didn't make it better. And so in my mind, they misdiagnosed the disease, and then they gave just the opposite of the right medicine. Now, the question you asked is, what were other things the government could do? And there are actually lots of things the government could do. For instance, in the United States, there were some people that thought we had a labor shortage. It was a debate about what was going on in the labor market. But if you thought that there was a labor shortage, why not get more women into the labor force? Easy way of doing that, especially in America, we don't have childcare. We don't have pre-K. And it would be good for the children and good for the economy. It would be good for our future economic growth. And there's clear evidence that pre-K has positive effects on learning. So that would be a prescription that would be good for the economy now and good for the economy in the long run. And remember, inflation is just a short-run phenomena that we're having because of this, episode that we've been through. But it is a good thing as you try to address that specific problem. They do things that are good for the long run.
Yeah.
Good medicines. And that's what we should have done. Now, in Australia, one of the issues is housing. And as I say, raising interest rates is the wrong medicine. In the context of housing, one of the things that should be clear, there needs to be more finance. When you think about finance, it naturally goes to mortgages. You have a very bad mortgage system here. I don't want to insult Australia, but
I don't think you'd find much disagreement.
And very different from that of the United States, where when the RBA raises interest rates, everybody's housing cost goes up immediately. It really puts the burden of adjustment to a mistaken view of the macroeconomy on ordinary Australians. It makes no sense. In contrast with what we have in the United States, which is fixed rate mortgages. But the real issue here is, can you get money to ordinary Australians at a lower cost? And I think the answer is very clear. Yes, you can. The government should set up a public option. And a public option would be something like the following. If you paid taxes for 5 years, that gives you the right to a mortgage related to your proven income and the value of the house, which the government has good statistics on transactions, so they know the value of the house. And the mortgage should be a fixed payment mortgage, so you don't have that kind of vicissitudes that Australians face today.
Yep.
You can show that a better mortgage is a variable to try to keep the real interest rate more stable. And unfortunately, current make them in the United States, make them volatile and have adjustments in maturity. So you can design a much better mortgage that gives people more homeowner security, which is really important. And the government can play a very important role there. There are three things. Let me just mention very quickly.
No, please. I mean, housing is probably one of the number one issue, or the number one issue on people's minds. It's been getting kind of worse and worse, not better, despite all attempts to fix it. So I think people would love to hear.
So another thing, the inflation more generally that Australia and the United States faces is caused by market power. I mean, it's not the only cause, but it's a major contributor. Markets have gone up. We've done a study in the U.S., more in industries with more market power. And the supply side interruptions have provided a context in which firms can more easily exercise that market power. There's no doubt that market power has played an important role in this inflation. That's also true in the housing market. And, you know, whenever you see large profits, it's a strong symptom of market power. Because if you believe in competitive economies, what we tell our students in basic courses, competition drives profits down to normal levels.
Mm.
When you see billionaires or multimillionaires in real estate, that says something is going on that is counter to this competitive model. And there's market power in the construction industry, market power in development. There's a lot of rank seeking having to do sometimes with zoning. There are many dimensions to this. It's a complex area, but what is clear is there's lots of ranks. And so that says there ought to be a government inquiry into competition in the building industry and try to make that sector more competitive.
Yep.
And that would bring down prices. So that's a second thing. Third is, I said before, the problem I see in many countries is government doing too little rather than too much. And one of the things that successful governments have done has been to take an active role in housing because markets don't work. And a whole variety of reasons why they may not work. It has to do with this market power I talked about before. A whole variety of reasons why markets often don't work. And countries like Singapore and in cities like Vienna, government has taken a very large role in supply of housing, and those cities are working. And housing has become affordable. So there is an alternative model available where government doing a little bit more can bring down the cost of housing. And finally, is tax policy. Your tax policy has contributed to, you might call it housing hoarding. It encourages people to stay in their houses, have more bedrooms, more square feet than they need because we call it technically a locked-in effect. And so if you changed your tax law, we've talked about constructive realization of capital gains in ways that would unlock a lot of this housing. It would increase the available supply of rooms, you might say square feet, on the market, and that would alleviate the housing shortage.
Talking about the role of government and the fact that they can actually do good things to build the good society, basically. I want to talk about tax because so often in the Australian debate, we hear, we can spend hundreds of billions of dollars on tax cuts geared towards the rich. We can spend $300 billion to buy AUKUS submarines, for example, but we don't have the money or we can't afford to do things like raise the unemployment rate, raise the unemployment benefits, or build public housing. And it seems, we kind of walk around those kinds of things. And again, coming back to your book and the idea that tax is always a burden, something that we're burdened with, rather than something that brings in revenue that we can spend in ways that kind of can improve society for everyone. I mean, housing is one idea there, but how much do we need to change the way that we think about tax and the ways that better tax policy can help us achieve a better society, a good society?
Well, I think taxes are nothing more than the what we pay for having a civilized society. I forget one of our famous Supreme Court justices said something along those lines. We know now how to raise revenue in ways that actually can improve the economy, and at the very least, don't distort the economy very much. And let me give you some examples. In terms of improving the economy, a tax on carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, discourages people from polluting. So you raise revenue and you discourage bad behavior. A financial transaction tax is a tax that discourages speculative activity, that causes volatility in markets, that causes macroeconomic fluctuations. So it's an example of a tax that makes the economy more stable and raises revenue. So those are examples of taxes that correct market failures and raise revenue. A second category of revenue raising is those that don't distort. Here, the most important example is a land and natural resource tax. If you tax land, Australian land, land value, the land in Australia is not going to get mad at you and say, we're going to go off and join another country. It's there. And the same thing, your iron ore isn't going to say, we're really mad at you about taxing iron ore. We're going to leave and we're going to go to another country. Now, of course, you have to be able to efficiently develop those natural resources. But doing that doesn't mean you have to give the companies who are the mining companies billions and billions and billions of profits.
But we love to do that here in Australia.
It's one of the mysteries when I come down here, and I come down here quite often. You keep doing it, and it makes no sense. They would willingly take and develop your natural resources for a fraction. They're making billions and billions. They would be willing to do it for just billions. And, as I say, of course, they're going to tell you that if you don't give them billions and billions, they'll just walk away. But they would say that, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they would.
They want more. 20th century, 21st century capitalism encourages people to be selfish.
Yeah.
And they are selfish. But remember, these companies, even the Australian companies, are global companies that are not owned by Australians. And so you're subsidizing, say, Americans, rich Americans. So I don't understand why you would want to subsidize rich Americans. It's an interesting policy, I like say, but it doesn't even make sense in terms of what we would call the political economy of Australia.
Yeah.
Why would you want to subsidize rich Americans?
Look, you've stumped me with that one because it's not clear to me either. And, I think it really is important to draw attention to the fact that, it's not a decision that we have to keep making. We can change it. And I guess to come back to your point about that you were making, for example, about things like childcare earlier, last night on Q&A, you were kind of making this point around gas and, the fact that we give a lot of it away royalty free, for example. And the line that we always hear back is, of course, well, it creates jobs and it creates investment and that kind of thing, but it's actually a very small employer compared to something like childcare. If we made childcare free, that would not only let women go into the workforce, but there'd be way more jobs in those service type industries.
Exactly. I mean, economics is about the allocation of scarce resources. And money is scarce.
Mm.
Unfortunately, you wish there were more mana from heaven, but it's scarce. And you have to say, what way is the best way of spending that money best for Australia today, best for Australia in the future? Well, it's very clear that if you want to create more jobs, giving a subsidy to mining companies is not the best way of creating jobs.
Yeah.
But I would be much more critical than that. The future well-being, prosperity of Australia depends on innovation, on the productivity of your labor force. Your gas industry is at most a 20-year, 30-year industry. The world is moving towards net neutrality by 2050.
Yeah.
There's a commitment to that. So that's an industry that's going to be phased out. Do you want to invest all of that in an industry that is dying?
Mm.
Or would you rather do that in something that's growing? Your research, your universities, people that enhance the capabilities of your citizens and their ability to be innovative and higher standards of living.
Mm.
Does mining lead to longer longevity, a better standard of living? No, it has just the opposite effect.
Yeah.
So if you think about where you want to spend those scarce dollars, do you want to subsidize mines or gas, or do you want to subsidize things that really matter?
Mm. There's a water there for you if you need one. Just sticking again, I guess, with how we can apply some of the lessons from the book on to the Australian context. Another kind of economic orthodoxy that we have here is always about balanced budgets, essentially. And there's been a lot of calls recently, for example, to rein in spending because we've got higher debts and deficit, thanks to the spending that we did in the pandemic, which was obviously needed. But it always comes back to this idea that Australia has to have this idea that we always need a budget surplus. I mean, is there anything in economics that says that's the way to do things, or that this now is the time to rein in government spending?
Well, no firm would ever look at the world through those lenses. You take a firm, a successful firm, it borrows or it gets equity investment so it can make investment. You look at a firm's balance sheet, and I've argued you always ought to look at a country's balance sheet. So if you borrow to make investments, like you borrow money to build more housing, you have a liability on one side of the balance sheet, you have an asset on the other. And that means if there's a scarcity of housing, your net worth has gone up. So that's a good thing. If you borrow in order to make investments in people, education, that, again, your balance sheet has gone up if you correctly measure your assets. Now, on the other hand, if you give away your natural gas or even sell it at below market value, and then you don't reinvest the proceeds, then you're poor because your assets below the ground are diminished and there's nothing compensating in terms of assets above the ground. So actually, your policy of giving away your natural resources is making you poor, and you ought to take a comprehensive view of your country's balance sheet. Another example of this, the most important deficit that you're creating is your environmental deficit. This is a global thing, but if we are engaged in environmental degradation through global warming, it's unambiguous. Our future generations are going to have to pay that debt in one way or another. That's a real debt. The financial debt is just some Australians owing money to other Australians. But this debt to the environment, we can't escape that. We're going to have to, future Australians, future Americans are going to have to pay that debt. There's one more perspective that I want to put across, that there is a concept that economists use called the balanced budget multiplier. If somehow you got in your mind this wrong view that you had to have a balanced this financial budget, you don't look at the assets, you just say, I want to make sure that if I spend more, I have more taxes. You can do that. I mean, I talked about all the ways you could raise revenues that are actually good for the economy, or at least not bad for the economy.
Yep.
If you raise revenue in that way and spend it, that's called a balanced budget, it actually stimulates the economy. And if you spend the money on things that are assets, you make the country wealthier. And so that's what you should be thinking about. So instead of giving away your natural resources, instead of undertaxing your natural resources, raise the taxes on them, charge royalties, that will give you more revenue, and then spend it more on housing or on universities or on infrastructure. That will make Australia wealthier.
You talked there about environmental degradation, and obviously Australia is a massive exporter of fossil fuels. And I guess I want to reflect on one of your Nobel Prizes is for the IPCC Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change. It is a huge issue here in Australia. We're already feeling the impacts of it.
Everywhere.
Yeah. Everywhere is, and much sooner, I think, than most people had anticipated. We haven't had a huge amount of luck here in Australia, for example, putting a price on carbon. So at the moment, polluters are essentially polluting for free while inflicting all this kind of damage. Is there a role for regulation to play here, or do you think regulation will start to come in more to managing these kinds of problems where we've seen great market failures?
Well, I think there's a very big role of regulation. And sometimes we underestimate that regulation can be very simple relative to actually making a market work, making a carbon market work. I actually think you need both, but we underestimate the efficacy of regulation. Let me give you, there are some regulations that are really simple. Don't cost anything to enforce, like no new coal-fired electric generating plants. Cost zero to enforce it. You can't get away with constructing, I think, say,
Oops.
Oops. We made a mistake. We thought we were constructing a renewable. That just doesn't happen. Stoplights are easy regulation and makes our economy, our transportation system work better. If you go through the various sources of pollution, a relatively small set of regulations would get at about 3/4 of the greenhouse gases. And that in turn would put less of a burden on carbon pricing and would mean that you could get to net neutrality by 2050 with a smaller tax. And that would be a package that I think would be more socially acceptable and less redistributive consequences, and very efficient.
Well, we might go to some questions from the audience now, and I can see we've got a fair few in here. I am going to start with a question from Stephanie Dowrick that's about how can Australian economic orthodoxy be substantially challenged when we have a mainstream media that's invested in the unjust status quo and commentators and journalists unable or unwilling to kind of amplify anything different, I guess?
That's a good question, and I think it's an argument why it's very important to have a more diversified media. I think a diversified media is absolutely essential for functioning democracy. So important that I think there ought to be government support. Now, you have the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And, we have NPR, but it doesn't get the same level of support. Some of the Scandinavian, Nordic countries actually have government support for newspapers.
Newspaper production.
And I think that's a good idea, because newspapers is part of the way we still get information. You have to have support for investigative reporting. I view news as a public good from which we all benefit. And one thing that we ought to be doing is making Google and Facebook pay for the information that you might say they steal from those who actually produce the information. You've done a little bit towards that in your bargaining code. You set a global example, and a lot of people are imitating it. But now that Facebook is sort of saying, well, we're going to leave, or we're not going to negotiate, your government is facing a challenge of how to respond. And we don't know how it will respond. The other approach, which I think ought to be given serious consideration, is a tax on these companies that are stealing the information. And part of that tax, a digital tax, be used to finance the production of high quality information. So that's at least part of the answer to the story. The other part of the answer is we need a strong civil society that can challenge the orthodoxies. The Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary. That's obviously what it does. I work with the Roosevelt Institute in the U.S. that promotes progressive ideas in the United States. These think tanks play a very important role in our society and help challenge the orthodox ideas, ideas that are increasingly being questioned. There's a widespread acceptance now in the United States that neoliberalism is dead. And the real challenge is not so much designing the coffin of neoliberalism. The nail has been put in that. The real question is what comes next. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, The Road to Freedom. I wanted to both raise the question of what comes next, and give some hints about how we go about constructing that next step.
Well, the next question is about your book. It's from Mary Walsh, who says, you say in your book that fascism and authoritarianism have largely arisen because of a failure of government to do enough or not doing enough. And in your view, how can we educate or teach people to understand the importance of government as an institution standing between them and massive corporate greed? So how do we remind people of the good that government can do?
Well, there are two sides of this. The corporations are helping us. The magnitude of their greed makes the teaching the lesson is easier. When we think about free markets, what they delivered in the United States, we start thinking about the exploitation of the financial sector, abusive credit card practices, predatory lending, and then bringing on the great financial crisis, where we had in the United States a bailout of some $700 billion through the government, and then hundreds of billions through the Federal Reserve, hidden so the taxpayers wouldn't see how much. We have the cigarette companies pushing products that they knew killed people. We have the opioid crisis, not only pushing products that killed people, but pushing back against government's attempt to restrain them. That was also true with the cigarette companies. We have the food companies pushing foods that lead to an epidemic of childhood diabetes in the United States. We have the fossil fuel companies pushing the fossil fuels, which are leading to climate change and denying it. I could go on, but, if you don't get the lesson that markets don't always work from these stories, I don't know what. So that side of the story, that markets underregulated are exploitive, seems pretty clear. I try to explain the problem in the following. The advocates of markets talk about how the drive for more profits leads to better products and lower costs. That's true. But it's also true that the drive for more profits leads to more scamming. And often, and all the examples I gave were examples of this, you can make more profits by figuring out how to scam, how to exploit, how to increase your market power more easily than you can by producing a better product.
So can you just explain that a little bit more? Or if you've got an example of where instead of doing something better, they go down the scamming route. Like, is that a more recent phenomena?
I think we've improved we've had a lot of innovation in scamming. And I'm using the term in a very general way of exploitation in a very broad sense. The pharmaceutical companies, like Purdue, could have produced drugs, pharmaceutical products, that address the real problems the world faced: malaria, the lots of diseases that we need drugs. But what did they do? They had an addictive opioid that they pushed, even though they knew it was addictive, and would kill thousands and thousands of Americans. And they made more money. Why? It's a good product. We call it repeat sales. And it gives you money. It's a kind of product that delivers year after year until the person dies. And then you go on to the next person. So that's an example. But you even think about, so many of us have Microsoft products. It could have made a better software, but it used a lot of its efforts into designing contracts that suppressed competition. And it's a monopoly. Google is a monopoly. And it was just declared that by U.S. courts. It was pretty obvious to me. And as a monopolist, you one of the things you do is you want to devote your efforts to maintaining and enhancing that monopoly power.
Mm.
You know, that's not you might say, scamming in the way that Trump University was scamming, but it is exploiting.
Yeah.
Because it allows you to take advantage. In that particular case, it's really very clever because it tells you, we're giving you something free. You can use Gmail free. Well, one of the things we tell our students is there are no free lunches. And what's the scam here? Well, they're giving you free Gmail. They're taking all your data for nothing.
Mm.
And then what do they do with that? They sell it to advertisers, to companies. And what do they do with that? They try to exploit you in one way or another. Online gambling tries to target the people most vulnerable to that kind of. They try to, find what are your vulnerabilities. They try to charge different people different prices, undermining the very basis of what makes a market economy efficient. So they're actually in the process of destroying the efficiency of the market economy, all in enhancing their profits.
Yeah. We don't have very long to go, so I know everyone always wants to ask you about the United States election. It seems like a month ago that we were headed towards another presidency for Donald Trump, and the elevation of Kamala Harris to the top of the Democratic ticket seems to have changed that equation entirely. What's your prediction for the US election?
I am hopeful and almost confident that she will win, and win significantly. The contrast couldn't be greater. It's not only age, and he is a little doddering.
Well, he's never made much sense.
He never made any sense, and he had always a hard time putting a sentence together. But the fact is, his policies make no sense, and his policies would exacerbate some of the problems we've been talking about. Inflation. What does he want to do? Put a 50% tax on imports from China. Ordinary Americans depend on imports from China for clothing, for appliances, for a whole range of goods. It would have a disastrous effect on their cost of living. And I could go through all his other policies. They would help the very, very rich, the billionaires. There's something very parallel to what the problem your government faced, and what Donald Trump would like to do. You have the stage 3 tax cuts.
Yeah.
The tax cuts that Trump enacted in 2017 were tax cuts really for the billionaires and the corporations. Some of those tax cuts expire in 2025, and he wants to renew them. And the Democrats say, no, we want tax cuts for ordinary Americans and tax increases for the billionaires.
Yeah.
So we're facing a little bit of that debate, but I think Americans will hopefully understand that while he says he's anti-establishment, he really is in favor of the very rich.
Well, in Australia, our stage 3 tax cuts that you were talking about, when they were first enacted, they came with tax cuts for low and middle income earners, but of course those were temporary.
Exactly what I don't know whether we learned from you or you learned from us, but what is clear is this gimmick is amazing. You entice them and say, oh, you're getting a little tax cut. And when they're not looking, you give them a tax increase.
Yeah. And I just kind of wanted to finish, I guess, on the good society, because I think democracy is obviously fundamental to having a good society, and elections are a huge part of that. And we've seen in the US, the January 6th insurrection and other really quite concerning things. If we want to finish with a good society, I guess, and a renewal of democracy in America and strengthening American democracy, what do you think that might look like?
Well, it wouldn't need to begin with the election of Harris. But it has many ingredients to it. One of them is the rule of law. No one, including the president, is above the rule of law. Mm. And this is why there's so much concern with the recent Supreme Court decision. The other thing is, what kind of people do we want to create? And as parents, we try to shape our children. And the president is a role model. Do we want a president who is like Donald Trump, a role model for misogyny, for fraud, for lying? Everything that we think of is the worst in society, he symbolizes. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats are trying to articulate an alternative vision of people who are honest, who care about others. A caring economy is part of what we are moving towards, hopefully. And you don't create a caring economy by having hedge funds maximize profits out of old age homes for dementia, saying, oh, they can make their own decisions. That's not a caring economy. Mm. So we want to create a society in which we not only celebrate values of the kind I've talked about, but create institutional structures that encourage that and allow this kind of flourishing of the best in all of us.
Mm. Well, thank you very much, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Again, the book is The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society, available in all good bookstores. As always, I'm sorry that we can't get to every single question. Thank you so much for all your participation today. We really appreciate it. The next edition of Australia's Biggest Book Club is coming up on Friday, the 30th of August, and I'll be speaking to journalist and author Royce Kermelovs about his new book, Slick, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil. And if you're interested in the Australia Institute's research or in signing up for any of our other events, you can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, and Dollars and Cents, as well as our brand new podcast, After America, which is following the US election. You can check those out wherever you normally find your podcasts or on YouTube. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you again, Professor Stiglitz.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.